Oh,
So hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to the House and Ballroom Community intersection of harm reduction and HIV. So my name is Miasha Forbes, or in Ballroom, I'm known as the icon Meeka, mother. And my pronouns are she, her, hers. Currently, I work as the assistant program director for 2 harm reduction facilities here in Brooklyn, New York. I've been working in harm reduction now for 6 years. Turn it over to Tim.
yes, yes. Thank you, Misha. So my name is Tim Tobias. Uh, for those who know anything about Ballroom that might be on, in Ballroom, I'm known as Tim, well, Princess for a long time, and then Tim Robin, which is a different house. Um, I am the executive director of a really small grassroots organization called Ballroom We Care. And I'm also a substance use counselor in the harm reduction program for an organization in New York City called Housing Works. And harm reduction is kind of new to me. So I'm kind of getting my feet wet, but it's a great experience thus far. And thanks for having us. My pronouns, I'm sorry, is he, him, and his.
So before we, Tim really gets into what Ballroom really is, I'm just wondering how many of you guys with a thumbs up emoji or reaction, how many of you are familiar with house and ballroom culture? Nice. So few of you.
Yeah, it's a few.
So few of you.
That's good.
That's okay. You'll be familiar easy. Today. You'll get a crash course in ballroom today.
Definitely, definitely. Okay. So we are actually going to go into talking a little bit more about ballroom and about the history of ballroom. One of the things that I like to start off with when I talk about this discussion is very similar to what Miasha just did, kind of like scan the room and ask people, have they ever seen Paris is Burning, Pose, legendary, right? So there's a lot of different shows that's out there that focuses on the entertainment aspect of ballroom, right? And normally when I ask that question, there's a few people, or there's always somebody who says, yes, I've seen those things, right? And that's important too. But I think that the reason why I always ask that is because people who've heard about ballroom, who have seen those things, only see that one aspect of ballroom, right? So in that sense, then I start to talk about why it's important then to talk about the history of ballroom, right? And it's important because ballroom consists of more than just entertainment, right? And we'll talk more about it, and you'll learn that ballroom is a culture in itself, right? So how did ballroom start? Ballroom has existed for a long time. I think documented maybe back in the 60s, but I think I'd like to believe that ballroom was around even longer than that. Maybe the Harlem Renaissance period, right? Ballroom was created as a subculture out of the LGBTQ, Black and Latino or Latinx culture of New York City, LGBTQ culture of New York City, right? And it was started because we needed to carve out space for ourselves. In a nutshell, we needed to carve out space for ourselves because we felt like we didn't have space within mainstream, what we call mainstream community. So what do you do as a community? You carve out your own space. So that was the reason why ballroom started in the very beginning. Ballroom is a place of resilience too, right? Going back to my earlier point, when we think a lot about what we see on TV, don't talk a lot about the resiliency that exists within ballroom, right? So it's a subculture, but more importantly, it's a resilient culture. And I think too, with ballroom, people come into the space for liberation. You know what I mean? They come into the space for liberation. Um, and it was birthed out of that. And I think within that came creativity, the supportiveness in ballroom, and just being really self-expressive. And ballroom is also a place for refuge for many of us who may have been rejected, devalued, isolated, or even abused, right? And today, this is very important. Today, it's a place where you will find a lot of resources from agencies, at least here in New York City, or organizations, right? And then in terms of structure too, ballroom consists of what we call balls, right? Which are actually the events that most of us might see in these shows that we talked about, right? Where you see the voguing, you see all the different categories, but then it also consists of houses, right? And the way I kind of describe that, think of fraternities or sororities, right? When we're in school, when we're in college, and it's a group of people that share a certain commonality, right? But have goals at the same time, right? Um, and just support one another. So that is almost what a house is like. And a lot of the houses come together and they compete at balls. But then there's a lot too that go into that aspect of how ballroom is structured. The houses consist of mothers and fathers who have leadership roles. As Miasha mentioned earlier, she's a mother, right? So that in itself carries a lot of information as well. Um, we have what we call commentators, right? And those are the ones who actually run the ball events, right? So they have a huge responsibility. And a commentator is really equivalent to a moderator. Like for example, for events like this, right? So the commentator is responsible for making sure that the ball flows. And then of course you have the disc jockey, the DJ, because you need music. And then last but not least, we have participants, right? Because we need people to participate. We talked about the houses, right? And the houses show up at balls. And for the most part, those are the ones who compete in the different categories. But ballroom is open to anybody. So you don't necessarily have to be a part of a house to be able to participate. So the participants is also a huge part of the structure. Um, More importantly, the ballroom community has influenced American pop culture. Like you see ballroom everywhere, right? And in the industry, while planting its seed around the world and empowering like the rise of other LGBTQ communities worldwide. However, as in any other community, ballroom has its liberating space, but it has its challenges as well. Um, and we're going to talk more about that later on, about what those challenges are, right? Unfortunately, substance use, so like I said before, just like in any other community, you have those challenges. Um, it's important to also say too, one of the biggest challenges in ballroom today is not just HIV. And like I said, it's substance use, right? That can lead to other issues such as homelessness, poverty, health disparities, etc. Right? So that's ballroom. Ballroom, it has many different components, but again, it's its own culture. And I think it's important to know, like I said in the very beginning, it's not just Pose, it's not just Legendary, it's not just Paris It's Burning. There's a lot of important components and aspects of ballroom.
Thank you, Tim.
Mhm. I don't know if you want to add to that, Miasha. Feel
Yeah.
free to.
Thank you. How many of you guys have heard of a person by the name of William Dorsey Swan? Not a lot of people, I would imagine. William Dorsey Swan was an enslaved African born in the 1800s. And while we know that pageants, because ballroom sprang from pageantry, and so while we know that pageants were things that have been going on since antiquity, ancient times, in some form or fashion, William Dorsey Swan was actually the first person to coin the term drag queen when they were arrested. So also very important is that they're really the first recorded individuals who actually hosted what we call drag balls, which is where house and ballroom community came from. So we actually came out of drag and pageantry. What ended up happening, of course, is that over time that changed, right? And so you have these ebbs and flows where it's like really popular, then it becomes underground, goes popular, goes underground. But this person was very instrumental in the ways that they actually used drag to be able to really push for legislation to, to really, and really honestly should be celebrated as like a forerunner of a lot of the freedom fighters that we do have within the African American culture. So that's just something to keep in mind, right? That they also housed and put on and really allowed people and provided space for people to gather who were queer or gender variant in some form before it actually became popular, right? So then you have, I would say maybe 1869, I believe. Yeah, 1869 in Harlem is where we would consider modern day or the very beginning of what is the modern day house ball culture movement, right? Which was started in Harlem. And so what it was is that you had some very wealthy African-American men who owned this building, this property, and they decided that they were gonna have these events. They would have many different events, but one of the events was drag balls, right? And so what happened is that, I don't know how many people, back then Harlem was it's kind of a melting pot, kind of like how it is now. So it's pretty much open to everyone. So you had a lot of white people, you had pretty much everyone kind of congregating in a way that hadn't been done before or anywhere else in the city, right? What happened is that over time, that movement then became co-opted by white drags. And so the Black contestants, it actually took 60 years, I think, for a Black contestant to actually win that pageant, even though it was started by African Americans. And so that led to a lot of course, as we know, time continues to move forward, and you're having a lot of different resistance movements popping up. And so of course, hostilities and all that stuff start to happen. So you have people maybe moving away from that and kind of forming their own. But it wasn't until the 1970s, actually the 1960s, towards the end of the 1960s, in 1968, which is documented in a movie called The Queen, where one of the co-founders of the house and ballroom community as we know it now was at a pageant. Andy Warhol was there, a lot of different celebrities were there. And in these competitions, it's important to note that not only did it take 60 years for a Black contestant to win, but in order to be seen as beautiful or to qualify, it was expected that the Black queens had to lighten their skins or paint their skins white, okay? So if you really look at the movie, The Queen, especially towards the end, and that's when you see Crystal Meth getting like really, really upset, and she storms off and she's like, you know what, I've had enough. I'm not coming back to this thing anymore. They told me that this was going to be, it's going to be rigged, but I came anyway because I thought that this would be different, and it wasn't. And you will notice that her skin was actually painted much lighter than her actual complexion. That is actually the beginning of what is called the house component, right? Because before it was just ballroom, right? So in 1970s, in the early 1970s, her and her friend Lottie which was another trans woman at the time, but I'm sure they identified as drag. You know, the names for our identities might change, but the experience is still the same. It still remains, right? And so today she would be classified, and she very well would identify as a trans woman. So two trans women decided that they were going to put on the very first house and ball event, right? Again, before, and they were going to call it the House of LaVesia Presents. And so again, this was the first time that the house component was introduced to ballroom, right? It was a way to not only separate themselves from what was traditionally this very white led kind of anti-Black pageant, to now being more focused towards the inner city and people of color and disenfranchised people. And what was really interesting about it was that they were now recruiting people who were in extreme poverty. I don't know how many people have seen what Harlem looked like or what New York looked like in the 1970s, particularly Harlem. It was not very beautiful, right? So you had a lot of abandoned buildings, you had a lot of, I mean, substance use, I think, was also on the rise, heroin, and all that other stuff that was happening at that time. And then of course, children being put out of their homes because of being gender variant or same gender loving. And so the house and ballroom community comes together to kind of create a surrogate community and a surrogate household to kind of house and support these people, right? So when we talk about house and ballroom, it's very, very important, like Tim says, that we also talk about the history of it, because the entertainment really is a way for us to empower ourselves, which a lot of people, again, of course, they're finding the entertainment in that, and that's great. But again, we had to really find ways in which to empower ourselves and to see ourselves as valuable in a world that did not, right? It amongst the system, within a system that did not, that threw us away, right? And so that's where that came from. So just to add that other component to that.
Thank you. Thank you. So what was my introduction to ballroom? I think, again, it's important to let everyone know that ballroom is a culture, right? Again, it has these different components, right? I grew up in New Jersey, which was not too far from Manhattan. Surprisingly, growing up, I've always heard about balls. My mom talked about balls. My mom talked about how her and her friends would go to these events in Jersey, right? And as a kid, right, you listen to conversations, adult conversations, and you take from it what you want, or you take from it what you think might be interesting or important. So, I mean, I didn't pay much attention to it, right? Because, and they didn't call, I don't think she called them balls. I think she called them something else, or they called them something else. But I do know that they were events, right? When I got older, and obviously started experiencing, I knew that they were events. So growing up as a kid, right, in a household that was just run by one parent, my mom, it was 7 of us, right? And it was challenging. It was very challenging. And then in the midst of all of that, I am figuring out what sexual orientation even means to me, right? So all of these things going on with inside of me growing up. By the time I got to high school, graduated from high school, again, I'm starting to learn more. I'm starting to make sense out of things. And then when I got out of high school, I got into college, I just got on the bus one day and I went over to New York City, to Manhattan. And that's how I kind of um, stumbled across the ballroom community. And I started learning more about ballroom. And I think that one of the things that really stuck out the most for me about ballroom was the connectedness amongst the houses, right? And then also too, when I found out about the entertaining pieces in the different categories, the dance category, the Vogue category too, was extremely captivating. So those were the two things that kind of drew me in. And then when I got involved, I felt like it was a space that I often longed, longed for, even as a kid, like growing up again, when my mom would talk a lot about the balls, or when I was trying to figure out what sexuality meant to me or sexual orientation. I didn't know that the ballroom community was the place that would answer all those questions for me. So when I got there, I just felt like this sense of safety and security in ballroom. Um, so of course that felt good, right? And I think that um, is part of a lot of people's experience when they found ballroom, right? Growing up again in a household where there was seven of us, and we had challenges and we had struggles, and then you within yourself is dealing with your own stuff, right? That space is that space that we need. So when I got to ballroom, started competing, um, and really developing like really good relationships in ballroom, right, with a lot of good people. And I often tell people now when I talk about ballroom is that it was definitely a safe space. It was definitely a space that I felt supported in, but I also learned a whole lot in competing. Like a lot of the skills that I learned in ballroom around being a competitor, I apply those skills to issues within my regular life, what we call our real lives, right? So that was like my introduction to ballroom, and I still even today apply a lot of those skill sets that I learned and that knowledge that I learned in ballroom to a lot of the things that I work on in my real life today. Um, Today, of course, in ballroom, my approach is a little bit different, right? But of course, I would always be a part of ballroom, just on a kind of like a different level today. And I think that because I've been in ballroom for so long, I've developed sort of like this sense of responsibility in ballroom, right? Like these are some of the things that I have to instill in certain members of ballroom, because this is what was instilled in me when I was coming up in ballroom. So my approach to ballroom today is a little different. And it's definitely a community that I don't regret being a part of.
Thank you, Tim. So my introduction to ballroom was a little by accident. So I was not born in the United States. I was born on the island of Jamaica, and I came to this country when I was 8 years old, and my family is very traditional, very conservative, uber conservative. They don't even really like to raise their voice. When they're mad, they're mad, but like they really don't like to raise their voice. They're very I can't I, it's something about them. I think the way that they carry themselves is very like composed. Um, so it, and also super Christian, religious Christian. Um, so I grew up honestly just always in the Bible and in the church. I mean, I spent so many hours in church. Sometimes I wouldn't get home until maybe like 4 in the morning. I would be there from 7 till 4 in the morning, choir rehearsal, traveling, singing, just doing a lot of like performances. I ended up really enjoying the arts. I saw the Firebird for the first time at Lincoln Center and fell in love with dancing. I was exposed to opera and classical music, and I took a lot of performing arts in high school and in junior high school. My mother was of course we were poor, so I had to find it where I could find it. But back then, like I'm really old, but back then they did have performing arts in school. They did have you were exposed to things that I think a lot of kids in maybe the inner city aren't really that privileged to experience now. And I remember just always feeling that something was off, like something was really different about me. I say off because I always felt like myself, but there was always someone else reflecting something else about me to me. And so I didn't understand what that was. I didn't really have a concept of that until I actually came to the United States, which was so strange. I didn't really understand what insecurities were or anxiety was until I actually came to the United States and actually went to public school and interacted with public school children who kind of pointed out to me that I was definitely different from everyone else. And then my mom, of course, started to realize it as well. And she used to just say little things to me like, if you're this, it's okay. I'll love you regardless. But then her actions would show something else. She would just go off. Like anything that happened in school, if I was a bit more feminine than everyone else, or someone, like there was always someone reporting something to my older brother who had gone to the same school as I did. So my mom was acutely aware of what was probably happening to me. I mean, everyone was except for myself. And I remember my mother did really foster a lot of the arts in me though. Like she really made sure that I watched a lot of PBS. I watched a lot of just a lot of documentaries on like different cultures and different, it just so happened that one night I was up really, really late and there was this program called In the Life on Channel 13. I think it must have been like 12 o'clock or something like, I don't know why I wasn't sleeping, but I was up and I was like, what the hell am I watching? Because it was just all these Black, queer, gay men just living and being happy and loving themselves and just like having a good time, excuse me. And one of the persons I saw was Willie Ninja, who is the father of the House of Ninja, and he's also in Ballroom. And I just remember being very captivated with him and the way that he moved and the way that he just carried himself. Like I was really, really just wrapped up. And that moment where you just see something and you just know, I didn't have the language, I didn't have any idea, but you see it and you're like, this connects with me on such a deep level that this has to be, I have to figure out what this is. And I remember a friend of mine, when I was 16 years old, she said to me, she was like, oh, my aunt lives down in the East Village. She's like, if you ever wanted to come down there, to hang out, that'd be really good. She was like, have you ever heard of this place called Christopher Street? I was like, no. She was like, well, she's like, no offense, but I want you to come with me somewhere and then you tell me how you feel about it. So she took me downtown. This was around during the summer. She took me downtown and we went to her aunt's house, but then after that we went to the village. And she was like, oh, this is the place that I was telling you about. And it was a dropping center for like LGBTQ. I had not came out yet. And I think she was really trying to do a really good thing because she saw that I was really struggling. I used to cry to her a lot about some of the feelings. I was very suicidal at that time. And so she was really trying to offer support. And she's actually one of my very, very, very dear friends to this day. And she brought me there and I met a lot of other kids. And then I also met some peer kids because this was when the peer wasn't as pristine as it is now. It was wood. You had to be careful how you walked on the pier or you would fall into the what is that? Is that the Hudson? Like you would just fall in, but they'd be dancing, there was music, there was all kinds of stuff. And I remember that there was more people and they were voguing and they were having a great time. And I was just like, oh my God, like I want all of this. I don't know what this is, but I want all of this. And then I started playing around and some people were like, oh, are you in a house? I was like, no, I don't even know what that is, And they were like, oh, well, it was like, well, who taught you? I was like, nobody taught me. I was like, I just picked it up. I just saw it. I was like, I'm a dancer. So I guess maybe that's what's happening. I was able to do things. I mean, I don't think I was that great, but I think what it was that I guess they saw something in me that I didn't see it myself. But it took me a while to really get into ballroom, maybe a year later, but I would just practice at home on, believe it or not, on vinyl. I would get like vinyl beats like Dindada and The Witch Doctor and all kinds of old things that I can find, and I would just teach myself. And then the following year, I went to my first house meeting. And then a few months later, I walked my first ball. And then a year later, in 1997, I won my first ball in Philadelphia. So I've been in ballroom since 96. So, and that's really my introduction introduction to ballroom. But ballroom, as you may have already guessed, that ballroom, again, it's more than just the entertainment, right? Because this was at a time where I was homeless. I was street homeless. I ended up leaving home. I ended up going back and forth between home because I couldn't really stay there. I slept on park benches. I slept on trains. I had to pretty much go into a supermarket to get something to eat and run out with whatever I could get. It was really that bad. And there was a group of us, just runaway kids, just really trying to find a way. A lot of us really turned to street sex work and substance use, of course, to cope. So again, more than just meeting that need, but really providing a place of safety and refuge for me at a time that I was most vulnerable. So again, this was mid 1990s, late 1990s. But prior to that, during the AIDS epidemic, it was a lot worse. Now, I came in pretty much before really, like maybe I would say when they were just making advancements with like the cocktails, because people were still taking cocktails at that time. They weren't taking just one pill a day. There was no one pill a day at that time. So folks that I had met were taking like 7, 8 different pills. They were still, there weren't that many clinics that were operational that were really serving the community in that way. It was really up to, this was when, I don't know how many people are familiar with Callan Lord, but this is right when Callan Lord was working out of the center. And so they really didn't have a space yet. And so they would have their truck where they would provide services and they would just drive around the village or drive around wherever they could to provide support. Now, Callan Lord, as you know, it is like a really big organization that's out there and really doing the work. But prior to that, they were working out of a van, really support. And I was there to see it, you know what I mean? Just to see the transition. So I'm gonna play a video right now, just so you can really get a deeper understanding of what it really was like during the height of ballroom, but also at the height of the HIV and AIDS epidemic.
Before you, Miasha, before you play that real quick, I just wanted to say something that I think is really crucial too. And I'm glad that you mentioned what you said about the AIDS epidemic, because when I came into ballroom, it was the height of the epidemic back in the mid 80s, mid to going into the late 80s. It was the height of the epidemic. And it created this crazy sense of fear, you know what I mean, in me and in us, even before I even got into ballroom, because I remember growing up in high school as a teenager, and again, struggling with my sexuality, not knowing what that really, you know what I mean, meant for me. But then I could also remember at that time, people would say to me, and these were people in my family, which was so unfortunate, that there's this thing going around, right? And you better not catch it, right? Just making these crazy assumptions, you know what I mean, that it's going to happen to me. And then fast forward, when I did get into ballroom, again, it was a height of the epidemic. Unfortunately, started seeing, you know, the relationships that I started building ending because people started passing away. Right. So that was a devastating thing for us in ballroom.
Thank you, Tim. Let me know if you guys can hear this, and if maybe I need to adjust something, just let me know.
The first time that I heard about the House of Latex was from my gay mother, Ada Pendalis. They just, you know, stormed in and, you know, had conversations with Jimmy C, and that's how the birth of the House of Latex began. The reason why Ada Pendalis became my mother when I was about 17, 16, was because I went to her house to become a member of the House of Pendalis. And she was in her living room sewing her outfits and all that. And some of the other kids that brought me there were like, oh, this is, Louis. At the time I was Louis. Louis wants to join the house and, blah, blah, blah. And so she was like talking to me and, the exchange was wonderful. But then there was something beautiful that she did that I was like, this is my mother. She said, why don't you guys go next door to the room next door and say hi to your sister? And so me still confused about the lingo of ballroom, I was like, sister, So I follow everybody else and I go in the room. There was a person that was laying in a bed and it was Foxy Pendarvis who was dying. And Avis, being a mother, was taking care of her daughter. Foxy died not long after that, but that was the first time that I saw somebody like really going through it because of AIDS. I used to keep a list of all of my friends that were HIV positive that died because I did not want to forget them. Because sometimes when you know so many people in the ball scene, you kind of, forget them with time. And sometimes ballroom celebrates them, but it's rare to find memories of people because we didn't really like videotape or have clips of some of the people that died. So I kind of wanted to remember them. I remember that list was already like in the 70s. And then I just stopped doing it because I thought that it was like this morbid thing that I was holding on to. I was holding on to these names for no reason. And well, I mean, there was a reason in my heart, but I figured, I could keep them in my mind and in my heart. And I remember, we lost Willie Ninja, we lost Denise Pendarvis Milan. There was a lot of people. There was Terry Milan and just hundreds of people. The ballroom scene lost hundreds and hundreds. As a matter of fact, a couple of World AIDS Days ago, the ballroom did some special event, and I think it was connected to an agency in Harlem, and they had a list, literally, of all the people that died in the ballroom, and it was in the 400s, at that time. More people have died since, and then there's names, obviously, that people forgot, and then there's names of people that people forgot because the other person died that would know who that person was. So ballroom was one of the hardest hits because we were such a small community of people. We were hit hard with AIDS, and information wasn't being given to us. And ballroom is about the showing off and the glamour and the who and all of that. And to go in there and say, oh, there's this thing happening out there called AIDS. You have to be careful. People didn't want to think about it and talk about it. I remember watching once Octavia St. Laurent saying that in 1981, people didn't even know what the fuck condoms were in 1981. And so I thought that was such a, coming from her, such a powerful statement because really that was our reality back then was that we didn't know that you had to just simply put on a condom for protection. Nobody was telling us that it would happen to us, uptown. Community wanted GMAC to be a part of, helping them in trying to figure out how can we help the community, the house and ball community. At the time, we didn't have anything really. Nobody was actually servicing us. And so GMAC was special because, they were able to, provide us services and bring us condoms. We needed information at that time because information wasn't really provided. I mean, a bunch of my friends were becoming infected. I myself was infected, or even before I even knew what latex was, or even joined the ballroom scene. The House of Latex as a house began because at first they would show up and have a table. They were doing tabling basically. and people did not want to get near the table. And so because of stigma attached to, if you're taking the condom, obviously, you probably have HIV/AIDS. And this is like the early days of in the 90s, of latex and all that. So somebody, I forgot who it was, but somebody suggested, why don't you guys create like a house within it? And so, because if they see that some of the participants are members of the house and ball community, then people will probably they'll be a little bit more approachable. And the conversations began around 89, 90. I believe the first ball was probably around 91, 92. And my first latex ball was around 93, 94, if I can remember that correctly. And I remember that actually I walked that ball. I remember that I was wearing platforms because at the time I was a drags runway. And so I remember wearing platforms, a big afro wig, because the category was supposed to be runway from a different era. So I wanted to do the 60s, but you were supposed to have some safer sex stuff on you. So I remember I had these balloons, and I remember that I had little in my skirt or whatever. I had condoms like sort of like pinned on my outfit, and so that was sort of like my little safer sex message as I was walking. I remember that everybody just like was cheering and all that. It was pretty fun at that time. So.
Okay. What did you? I think sometimes when you're part of something, you don't really realize how sometimes it's easy to kind of miss certain things because especially if you've experienced it so much, you almost become desensitized to it a little bit. You know what I mean? It's like, especially when he talks about being in the same room with someone, and we're not talking about someone today who may be passing away. We're talking about in the 80s, at the height of the AIDS epidemic. We're talking about what historically the face of AIDS looked like. And just to see that as a first introduction into ballroom, into the house, I think, like Tim said, you never forget those things. Those things definitely stay with you for a very long time, for a very long time. That you're most impacted. People talk about social disparities of health and they talk about all these things, but when you're actually living it, it's a very much different reality and experience. It's not very easy to forget.
Right. No, and I think
Yeah.
too, to add on to that too, Misha, I think we as a community, and it's weird to say, but I think we're traumatized. And I think sometimes we're traumatized over and over again. It's a space, we talked about how it's a space of resilience. It's a space of liberation and refuge, right? And those things it truly is. But at the same time, these things that happen, right? And how Luna talked about how it's impacted, HIV and AIDS has impacted ballroom. And then a couple of other things that we're going to talk about eventually later, how those things traumatize us as a community.
Yeah, absolutely. Because there can't be any healing if nothing has changed, right? If communities that are most marginalized continue to experience the same disparities, even after there's so many different advantages and to other communities, right? Where other communities are being served. When it comes to the resources and opportunities, they're just not the same. And as a subculture of the larger marginalized community of Black and Brown people, those of us who happen to be LGBTQ and trans, right? We experience that marginalization that at a much greater level than even our community, right, that we come from, right? But it's interesting though, how, marginalized communities will always create solutions to kind of to help and to support where there is none, right? So like, I think about just how the house and ballroom community is a form of harm reduction, right? How community and creating a safe space for folks who would be street homeless, who might not have support, familial support, access to food, access to clean water, access to healthcare, even just access to emotional support, right? Mental health support. Mental health is a very big thing in our community, right?
Yep.
But we know that communicating and being social with other people really helps with those feelings of isolation or abandonment, right? So even just thinking about in the 80s, right, where a group of substance users and those advocates, how they created needle exchange, right? That were it not for them, we wouldn't have needle exchange, right? How we had groups like ACT UP and those who were diagnosed with HIV and AIDS around that time, how they actually had to force the government to pay attention, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't have the medications that we have today, which is like saving so many people. What is it, 2.5 million people living healthy with HIV because of those grassroots efforts that marginalized communities had to create because they were cut off from opportunity, because they were cut off from resources. I know Tim does a lot of work when it comes to, in ballroom now, Crystal Meth seems to be the number one thing that's really attacking ballroom right now. And I wouldn't necessarily say that, I would say more so, why is the need or the use of crystal meth so prevalent in this community? Not so much the actual use, but just why, right? What's happening that folks are turning to substances or more and more substances, right? That they're dying, right? That perhaps maybe they feel like they don't deserve to be here, right? There's something happening. Go ahead, Tim.
Yes, you're absolutely right too. And I just wanted to piggyback off of something you said earlier too, before I talk about Ballroom We Care. You talked about how ballroom in itself is like a form of harm reduction. It definitely is. I just wanted to give everybody a really good example of that. When last year, when we were hit really bad by COVID, right? All of us, the entire, not only country, but the entire world. Closer towards the end of 2020, or maybe in the summer, balls were still popping up. Balls were happening, right? And you had a lot of people saying, a lot of conversations, well, why are these people still having balls when they know that, COVID is out there and they're putting themselves at risk, right? You kept hearing a lot of those conversations. But if we think about what Miasha just said about ballroom being a form of harm reduction, that's exactly what's at play, right? Because we all know how, because of COVID, it created a lot of mental health conditions or mental health situations for a lot of us. And that too was for those of us in ballroom. So where did we go when we needed to cope with stuff like that? we went to ballroom like we always did, right? We went right to that space, those spaces, those harm reduction spaces that existed for us that we created, right? So I just wanted to share that. And I just thought that that was really important because when Miasha said that, I instantly thought about that. Like even during COVID, we felt the need to have these boards because we needed that space, right? And
And
I
I
know
will,
we,
sorry, Tim, also online too. A lot of folks
yeah,
really found
mhm,
ways to kind of create ballroom online. And that was very, very, I mean, for a lot of people who couldn't go out and couldn't gather. And I know when we talk about gathering, that we usually go to like all the reasons why people shouldn't gather. Um,
yeah, yeah,
Also, yeah.
right, right. And I know,
Precautions and all. Just wanted to clarify.
right, right, right. And I know we only have a few minutes left, so I'm gonna go as quickly as possible with our ballroom care. So when we talk about substance use and ballroom and harm reduction, like we mentioned earlier, you had people in ballroom who indulged in substance use, right? They use it to medicate, to self-medicate, because people come in ballroom um with a lot of challenges, right? And Misha and I talked about that earlier. So yeah, there's a lot of substance use that existed back then that still do. So a few years ago, we noticed that crystal meth started becoming a crisis in ballroom, and I think, like Misha mentioned, to a point where we started seeing young people dying, and later finding out that they struggled with crystal meth. So that's when we got together, a few of us in ballroom, and we said that we need to do something. We didn't know what, but we needed to do something. We sat at BBQs on 23rd Street in Manhattan with a pen and pad, and we're just jotting down ideas. Fast forward a few years later, we developed a grassroots organization called Ballroom We Care. And Ballroom We Care focuses specifically on individuals in ballroom who are struggling with crystal meth use or mental health related issues, right? And simply what we do is we provide support for those who are experiencing those challenges. We identify resources, we have trainings, crystal meth basic trainings that we provide the community to learn more about what crystal meth is and what it does to the body. We increase awareness where we're at ball events. Like I talked earlier about agencies being at balls and talking about their services. So with Ball When We Care, we do the exact same thing, and that helps us increase awareness around what we do for the community. Um, and we provide support. We do individual counseling, one-on-one counseling, and we also do supportive counseling for individuals who are interested in that level of support in ballroom. And I think that it's definitely a form of harm reduction. I think when we think about it, and Misha and I was talking about this yesterday, we, especially through COVID, we did a lot of panel discussions involving the community, members of Ballroom, and also allies, and talked about ways in which we feel it's important to tackle meth use or even other issues in ballroom. And a lot of what came out of those discussions is how do we approach it from a harm reduction perspective, as opposed to head on, right, and focusing on abstinence, because we know ballroom, right? We know how unique ballroom is, and we know some of the things you do and just don't do when it comes to ballroom in terms of how to engage them. So a lot of those discussions really focused on just meeting the individuals where they're at, right, and providing tools and services that we know that aligns with the challenges that they're faced with when it comes to substance use and crystal meth. So I don't know if you want to add more to that.
Yeah, I just wanted to also say that, especially when you talk about harm reduction, you have to recognize the inherent harm in the ways that we've um, illegalized substance use, right? The ways that we've attached punitive consequences to folks who use substances, the ways that we also criminalize people who have HIV and AIDS, the way that we criminalize and stigmatize people who may have a whole host of other lived sexual health experiences, right? The way that we stigmatize and criminalize mental health. We criminalize and kind of strip people of rights who use substances, right? So, you know, really understanding that that's wrong, right? Because traditionally, especially, I mean, people use substances throughout time, throughout history for many different reasons, whether recreationally or whether spiritually, right? It wasn't until you started to introduce all these other social determinants, these disparities that really created such really hard environments and when you think about modern day, right? The war on drugs, when you think about redlining, when you think of Jim Crow, when you think of cutting people off again from opportunity and resources, you're going to see addiction, right? So there's a clear kind of distinction, right, between addiction and substance use, right? Substance use in itself is not inherently a bad thing, right? I mean, we all use substances, right? It just depends on which ones are legal and which ones are not legal, right? And that really depends on who decides to make what legal and illegal whenever they see fit, right? The real thing that we have to take away, or the takeaway for me, is understanding that people who use substances are experts in their own lives, and they need to be treated with dignity and respect, right? Wherever they're at, whatever is happening, you have to be able to meet whatever that immediate need is. I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with Rat Park, the study Rat Park. So Rat Park, you know, just to be, I don't necessarily care for a lot of studies, and I definitely don't want to associate people with rats, right? But just like human beings, rats are very social people, right? And this particular study kind of created this situation where they had starved a lot of rats, and then they created this environment for them, and kind of like created these two studies where one group of rats had this really great living environment, and then you had another one that really did not have that much access to really thrive like the other rats, right? And so you gave them two substances. One was water and the other one was laced, I think, with like some kind of drug, right? And so usually what happened was during that study that the rats who experienced the most disparity in that scenario always went to the substance laced water, right? And the rats who had this really great experience, they always went to the water. What happened is once you started to change the environment, the rats then started to go to that laced water less frequently, right? And so we understand again, the very big difference is that if people don't feel seen, if they don't feel heard, if they don't feel as if they have a place in this world, fuck it, sorry, this is just, you know, if they don't feel like they deserve to be here, or to even exist, if I don't believe that I have a right to life, I'm not really going to do much to kind of preserve my life or do anything to safeguard my life, right? But when you start to really treat people like people and give them back their humanities, the ways that we've afforded other people, you really see that folks are very receptive to that. Now, if your goal is to stop people from using drugs, God bless you. I mean, if it happens, it happens, right? And I'm sure you might get some people who for a really long time can do that. And that's their choice and their right if they want to do that, right? But for a lot of people, we have to also understand that there's pleasure, right, in some of the things that we do. Hell, in most of the things that we do, or else we wouldn't do them, right? And so we also have to remember that, especially when we're talking about substance use, that people gain pleasure from that. It provides a need for them. It makes them feel good. And there's nothing wrong with feeling good. People who smoke cigarettes, they smoke cigarettes because it makes them feel good. It does something for them, right? So again, if you're going to take something away from someone, you better know what the hell you're going to replace that with, because what's going to happen is that they're going to go right back to it because you haven't changed the conditions that produce that in the first place, right? So for me, I'm a kind of person that if I have to give someone clean supplies, if I have to give them clean works, if I have to give them, abscess kits, if I have to give them safer smoking kits, if I have to sit there with them while they are getting high, then that's what I'm going to do to prevent an overdose. If I have to train their friend in Narcan so that they don't use alone, so that if they experience an overdose, then that person who's there is able to respond and actually knows the laws to be able to intervene and sit with that person until EMS comes, how to call EMS, what to say when you're calling EMS, right? Not calling 911 just because someone's high, right? Understanding and recognizing the difference between overdose and someone being high, right? These are things that we can do. These are harm reduction tools that we can use. You know what I mean? Making sure that someone, before maybe they use, that their other needs are met, that their bills are paid first, right? Whatever it is that you have to do to really recognize the humanity in people, first and foremost, and listen to them, hear what it is that they need, and provide that need, and let them take care of the rest, right?
Yep. You said it. And I just want to just add to that, because that was amazing. I met with a client yesterday and I asked him, what do you know about harm reduction? He said it's a realistic approach to helping individuals get clean. And that was it. That was it.
So
So I think that
Well,
concludes.
I don't know if we have time for questions or if we're done. I'm not really sure if we have any time for questions.
we may have time for maybe one or two questions if we can make them quickly. But again, I just want to thank you guys for this session. It was very powerful. And also, I want to do a shameless plug. Tonight, Role Models and the North Carolina AIDS Action Network will be having a fashion show. And within the fashion show, there will also be a overall performance category and best dress category. So if you want to witness firsthand some ballroom aspects, please come out tonight. It's at Culture 704 inside of the Nightclub and Lounge. But if you check out social media, we'll have the flyer and all that stuff available for you as well. Does anyone have any questions before we conclude? I'm not hearing any questions or hand raised, so I think we're good to go. Again, thank you, Kim and Meeka. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
Y'all have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.